Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and I'm joined by Rachel.
Hey, y'all.
And Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Hey.
Hey. Wow.
Hey.
That was lackluster, but, it left me wanting more from you, a greater response. Today, we're talking about a lot of, really the overarching topic is about how uncomfortable it is to talk about sex as Christians and in the church. And I figured what a better way to start off this conversation than talking about the Apple conference. That was on Tuesday of this week, where everyone thought they were going to announce a new iPhone, but instead they just talked about a watch and an iPad, and that is really what left me wanting more. Is they didn't give us a phone.
They didn't give you a phone?
No phone announcement.
Things.
I know, it's really rough. And this is kind of a boys versus girls situation because the ladies at the table here are Android users.
Yeah,
I am.
And the boys
My computer
are iPhone.
Yeah.
So you don't even care about this Apple event. Then
wake me up when you're done.
Yeah, we just got an update recently, so we're good to go for a little bit. Yeah,
like a software update.
We did get a software update that rolled out.
It did.
New features?
Yep.
iOS 14.
What's that mean? Sharper pixelation?
Yes.
I've had it for a
More
while.
pixelations.
There are some pretty cool features in it.
Widgets.
A fourth
Oh, so
lens
now
option?
you guys are finally getting
Yeah.
widgets, which is something that we've had for, I don't know, years.
Yeah, but
probably.
see, Apple, they made them good.
Good widgets. Okay? We got good widgets. Yours don't even work half the time.
Yeah. And Apple makes sure that we can only select from a handful of them, and we wouldn't, but that way we won't break
Because
our
they care.
phone.
Right.
They care about what.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is my question. When you search something on your Apple phones for Apple users, what comes up as a search engine? Like if you're searching, is
I
it
typically ask Jeeves to Google me something.
Jeeves is still working? What? I used to use him like back in high school.
Oh my goodness.
Yep, he was the original.
Yes, ask Jeeves. Rachel, did
I
you?
don't even
have you
know.
heard of
We
him?
call him the OGs.
I don't even know.
Oh man.
Oh,
Take
yeah. You
that,
know me.
Alexa.
Yeah.
Alexa was born in 2014. I learned that the other day. 'cause
she's
my
not
kids-
happy.
My kids asked her that, like, Alexa, when were you born? And she's like, November something 2014. So
Oh wow.
See, your question just failed. I know where you were going, though,
Yeah.
Jess. You're trying to point
everybody's looking.
out that we're using Google's search engine on
That's what I'm wondering.
that's
It's
true.
an honest,
It's true.
humble question.
I guess it's...
yeah. One of the most fascinating things about Rachel, beside the haircut she got.
Yes, you look amazing,
this week.
Rachel. I love
I
your
feel
hair.
like we need to have a segment
Okay.
just about my hair.
So if you're
at this
listening,
point.
Rachel, you cut off like what, 10
at
inches?
least 10. Yeah,
Looks
Wow.
great.
yeah, it's a lot lighter. So
But one of the fascinating things about her is, and you don't see this very often in the world, people that are Android, but then they have AirPods.
yes, I do have AirPods.
Oh.
See, this is
How
the
does that
thing.
work?
Yeah. Well, when I got married, I naturally had to switch over to Android just because that was the family phone. So you have to stick with your family or whatever. But
Yeah, you can't
I
have a
don't
green
know.
bubble, blue bubble relationship. in a
Exactly.
marriage.
A lot of that
Yeah.
kind of it just doesn't work. So, but I don't know. I might be switching back soon. Who knows?
Ooh,
we'll
scandalous.
see. We'll see if
That
they
is
impress me with
scandalous.
this.
It'll be good that you'll
new
move away
phone.
from that abomination of or Android and AirPods. That just
Yeah,
seems
that's just wrong,
sinful.
isn't it? Yeah.
We'll pray for you.
I'll be honest. I would probably be pretty disappointed. I assume they're going to have another one, obviously, in October because they're going to release a phone. That's just what they do to make money. But I would usually be kind of disappointed in something like this. But then it came with Nebraska football being back the next day in the
Just
news.
couldn't help yourself, could you?
So
Gosh.
that was the
In
real
case you didn't
announcement.
know.
That was the announcement that I was really
We
anticipating.
literally can't go an episode without talking about Nebraska football, can we?
Gosh.
Maybe we will once it's finally here. Then I'll get my,
Do you want to insult people in band while we're at
No,
it?
I
this
didn't
week?
do that. That was not at all. That was not at all. Like, my daughter does dance. I'm all about the
nailed it.
arts. I'm all about all of those
I'm
things.
all about the art.
But they don't matter unless there's football.
No, I was just trying to help us understand the repercussions.
I'm just teasing
around this. But I did have a Runza, and so that also filled some of that longing for Husker football.
You're just covering everything. Anything else?
Would you like to?
I would like a sponsorship from Runza. That'd be
Is this
cool.
just your new blog? Like, what did Alex? Dear Diary. Today, my friends made fun of me for hating on.
We were
bands.
talking about Rachel's hair. We could talk about Jess with her, smartwatch that's got,
No, this is a Fitbit.
her Fitbit. She's got the double pattern on today. She's really liking the cats. Carol Baskins now she's on Dancing with the Stars.
He's just transferring the. No, it's not going to work,
Deflecting.
Alex.
Are you rooting for Carol Baskins on Dancing with the Stars?
No, but this is the
Look
first.
like it.
This is the first season I might watch. I like some of the other people on there. Nelly is on there.
Okay.
AJ from the Backstreet Boys.
This
Alex, you probably want to watch now. Back at you, buddy.
I'm in.
Yeah, this is how he supports the arts. All right, everyone, we're about to go into headlines. This week in headlines, up first, Candace Cameron Bure is not sorry about PDA photo with husband. Now, if you're not sure who this is, I mean, she's kind of a 90s icon from being DJ on Full House.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's Kirk Cameron's sister. That's another claim to fame. I mean, she's in a slew of Lifetime movies now.
Hallmark.
Hallmark.
It's Hallmark.
Yeah,
sorry.
wow, get that
I messed it
right.
up. Excuse me. Messed
She's
it up.
on Hallmark for Christmas movies and Hallmark music movies and mysteries.
Yes.
And I would know.
You would know.
Yep.
Okay. But I mean, more recently,
Cookbooks,
Fuller
all
House. They
kinds of
made the
things.
remake
Yeah.
of
Oh, yeah.
Full
Yeah.
House.
Fuller House.
But she had posted a couple photos on Instagram, and they were just of her and her husband, and there were two. And when you swiped over to the second one, they were like standing on a bridge or something. He had his arm around her, and his hand was resting on her breast, and that caused a lot of people to be very upset with her and say, "How could you post this? Like, what is shouldn't you be responsible for your appearance?" And a lot of outcry. And I think she even said she started to apologize. She started to kind of write an apology or something. And then she was just like, you know what? I don't think I need to.
Yeah.
Is that the gist of it?
I kind of wonder. My thing is, I kind of wonder if she would have just posted like a picture of her in like a swimsuit that maybe was like, not as modest or whatever. If people would have had such an outrage as they did with this picture, where it was like just her, by herself, but maybe she wasn't wearing something as modest. But now it's like all of a sudden that there's a guy involved, and he's, which he's her husband. So immediately when I saw this, I was like, this is so dumb. Like, it's her husband. Like, why are people freaking out? There's stuff way worse on the internet these days that you could be freaking out about.
Well, it's a weird response for Christians to have, because we're constantly telling people, young people specifically, and single people to like save themselves from marriage. And this is the time when you can, once you're married, you have each other, and so that's a little bit of a mixed message, I feel, in some ways. But I guess the only way I can see where maybe people are coming from is like, well, you're a public figure, and maybe this, I don't know, represents you poorly. I'm not sure. Alex, I can see your gears are grinding.
Yeah, I mean, for me, do I think it's wrong? No, I don't like. But I'm also like, I don't know that I would do that. Like my wife definitely would not allow, and that's just personality wise. Anything that would draw more attention to her, she would be like totally anti. And so she, like, I could see like us laughing about that, or like like sending it to in like a family chat, like where we're like, oh, ha ha ha, look at those two, because I think too, most of my family were like the super conservative. They'd probably say like, use words like prude people,
they would be scandalized.
And so they'd be like, oh my gosh. They'd just get a reaction. So I could see sending that in like a chat, with my family, but probably not like putting it on my Instagram or ever see her putting it on there. So that's just my point of view. But I also am like, I don't think it's like inherently nasty or bad.
Yeah.
So
I think said it, Rachel. It's like, would anybody care if she was wearing like a tube top or a two-piece or something like that? To me, like these things just exhaust me because it's like another thing. I think I looked at the post, which most of her posts get like 1,000 likes or comments. And this one had like 19,000 comments on it. So obviously there's probably like people debating in the comments and things, but it's like, it's another thing. And I looked because I was curious, because I figured like with our culture now, I was like, okay, is this going to be like a Candace Cameron and like everybody does it to like support her like with their husband?
New Instagram post.
Like a trend.
Like we support, you know.
Did you start the trend?
I can't say maybe I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I would be interested to see what people's comments were though on the post of like why are people so outraged?
And if you follow her, you know like where she stands with Jesus. Maybe I'm like downplaying it because I obviously want to validate the people like that could trigger somebody that like has an addiction, or maybe a picture like that is triggering something else. But also I don't think she meant it to be like, yeah, look at this.
Right.
I mean, she said in her the comment on the pictures is sweet and spicy. And I'm like, isn't that what marriage is?
Yeah.
Shouldn't our relationships be a little of that? But it's like, who are we inviting into that?
Right.
And so maybe that's a question for us to ask ourselves is like, okay, because she invited people then to make those comments and say those things.
Well, and part of her response was, this is my husband of 24 years. Thinking it was inappropriate makes me laugh because it's my husband. Or this is a video response that she had. She posted to her story. And she says, we have so much fun together. He can touch me anytime he wants, and I hope he does. This is what a healthy, good marriage and relationship is all about. So I'm sorry if it offended you.
That's good.
So I think that's a valid stance, and I think that, you know, maybe it's this kind of transitions into our next headline, I think, because I think that a lot of the outcry probably comes from parents who are like, well, my kids love your show, and maybe they follow you on Instagram, and if they see this, I don't want them seeing that. You know?
And it also highlights like sex is very distorted.
Yeah.
And, you know, that also could be like someone that has been abused, or someone that's like, that could be a triggering sign of like submission, or like, this is my property type thing. And so I think it just caused these little,
there's so many different perspectives.
Didn't expect it.
Yeah.
So you two gals, do you think you would ever have that on your Instagram?
Probably not. My grandma follows me, so I don't know if I'd allow that for her to see.
Yeah.
What about your Sinstagram? Second Instagram.
They're not supposed to know
I think
about
people have those. I probably would, because I don't see it as like a necessarily huge deal. So.
Yeah.
All right.
But I'm not going to be friending anybody that's listening. So
Okay.
don't.
There you go. Everyone's got their
Starting
pop
the trend.
When's it going to happen?
The next headline comes from New York Times. It says, Cuties sparks a firestorm again after its Netflix release. So if you're wondering what again means, it sparked a firestorm when Netflix poorly marketed this movie with a poster that felt very grossly inappropriate. So this is a really, really tough conversation to have in a lot of ways, just because of the society we live in right now, where everyone is just outraged about everything without even knowing anything. And I think there are things in this story to be very outraged about, but maybe like there's room for understanding too. But anyway, several members of Congress have weighed in on this award-winning film, calling for the removal of Netflix. The Justice Department has gotten involved. The hashtag cancel Netflix, trend has started. It's a lot.
And it's not about oranges, right? I was talking to someone about this today that we're going to talk about it, and they're like, oranges?
Yeah, there's a big scandal involving.
But not everyone knows about
oranges.
it.
So if you don't know about it, it's a French movie. It's not produced or made by Netflix, but it was made by a French director. Netflix does that a lot. They pick up different movies from all over the world. And it kind of it's about an 11-year-old girl who's growing up in a Muslim family living in France, and she joins a dance crew of other 11-year-olds, and there's a lot of inappropriate dancing in it. I think the original poster that came out, they were in very adult themed clothing in poses that would be considered lewd. And so then the film kind of follows with a lot of young actresses dancing in these kind of inappropriate way, or not even kind of very inappropriate ways for a child to be dancing. And so that's where this outcry really stems from.
And I think some other cultural backdrop too, knowing like in California, they're talking about pedophilia, and is this an actual, sexual orientation and all that kind of stuff. So it's another one of those cases where I think a lot of people merge a lot of these things coming together, and it's easy to see both and assume that all these people are collaborating to make this happen and push an agenda.
Right.
So
not even that, but like with this widespread QAnon stuff that's been going on, whether it's the Wayfair scandal, whether it's the this whole idea that there's this cabal of pedophiles who are all working together, and Trump is trying to defeat, like, there's these conspiracy theories out there that this sort of stuff is just like feeding that fire.
And at the same time, there is real things going on too. Like you shared something from Underground Railroad, who those people, they spend their days and nights searching
trying to find people who are and I think this was also like horrible timing on their part. Why would you ever think that was okay to release something like that during a time when there really is a heightened awareness of like sex trafficking of children and like the pedophilia stuff that's like, I just think, man, that was just really bad. And I think for me, I mean, people are going to have different convictions. I think for me, the whole cancel Netflix thing, at first it does sound kind of crazy, but when I do start to think about, it's not just this one instance. Like they released a movie called 365 Days recently, and it was about a guy who captured a woman and like basically took her on as his own sex slave, and then she fell in love with him in the end, and it was this romantic movie, and people are watching this and like it's setting up a cultural idea that is these things are okay. These are good. This is what you want.
Desensitizing.
Yes. And so it's not just this movie necessarily, but I've seen stuff pop up on Netflix over and over and over and over again that is just so, I mean, they're all rated, R or mature, and just because they're starting to really just lean into that and normalize the sexualization of everything and everyone, and it's just
Yet at the same time, we just had Lisa on here, right? Come on and talk about a documentary that was released on Netflix exclusively for highlighting the injustices and telling her story and how much that was able to be freeing, and just that whole story, the power that like happened from it. And that was an emotional, thing for her. But so all these mediums have good, bad, and that's where it gets difficult to, I think, have some of this conversation.
I think, and that's what I said, it's like a personal conviction of, you really have to weigh out, is there enough good on this that I'm willing to support this medium, or is it so much bad and maybe a couple of good things? It's like, I don't know, I'm still processing through this because this is a very new thing obviously right now, but there's a lot.
I watched it and I definitely would say that it's not one of those movies, obviously, that you're going to watch and then like, hey, let's keep that around and watch it again. It was very tasteless, and there were times that, I mean, I like wanted to fast forward because it's very uncomfortable. And I was thinking as I'm watching it that it can be a gateway for people that maybe haven't stepped into child pornography. And I know that's like a heavy thing to say, but it's something where it's like you could replay certain scenes and it's going to cause somebody to have an issue. And the things that they made those girls do in the movie, it's disgusting. The conversations that they had were gross, and there's not any way to mince that, but was it worth it? Because I do think that children were exploited. They didn't I think like a lot of times like, oh, you're doing this because you're going to shine a light on something. But did you accomplish your mission? I don't think so. If people are going to question what comes out and it's going to cause this much of a controversy, did you accomplish your mission? I mean, we're talking about it, but in a very negative way.
I think too, back to real quick, to the Lisa conversation and how she was saying that these girls were conditioned at very young ages, and people are like, why didn't you just get out? You didn't have a choice. And like you're saying that they made these girls do it. And obviously all these girls have parents. I assume, I don't know everything about the details, but obviously there's some parents that allowed this to happen, and I'm assuming like these weren't slaves, these weren't girls that were forced into, like, they weren't trafficked into this movie, right? But so there was parents and a lot of adults that allowed this to happen. But then you do get into like, what does this do for these girls' future? How is it shaped? Did they even really have a choice? Were they forced into something like this because they thought it was good? It's French culture is completely different when it comes to sex and all of that, and normalizing it. So there's so many. I have 3 daughters, and so to me, I haven't watched it. I don't think I could watch it, because I think for me, it would just... there's things that I will watch because I want to know how they are, but based on the clips I've seen, and I have seen some clips of it, I'm like, I can't do that right now, and picture their faces as that. Right. And so...
I would say for me, I'm a skeptic about everything. So when I see outrage, my gut reaction is this is overreaction. Yeah. Like that's just my personality. So I chose to watch it because I really wanted to know what was really there. And you do hear that from the director herself saying that this is a social commentary on what we are exposing our children to, and the effects of social media, and I think that there is gravity to that. I do think that what she's saying there is true. Using actual children actors to display that is where it's just, you can't condone that, right? You just can't condone that. But I when watching this film, just to give people a premise of it, this girl, she's 11 years old. She's raised in a Muslim family. Her mother's just found out that her father is going to be marrying again, because in the Muslim faith, at least in certain sects of it, they can take on multiple wives. And so she's like hiding in this room and hearing her mother go through this trauma of hearing that her husband is going to marry another woman, and she's just heartbroken about it. And this, so you see the girl hearing this, and you start to realize how many parallels you can draw to our society now, whether it is that culture or any other culture, the way that children feel alienated and they see their parents hurting, and there isn't clear lines of communication. And from her perspective, she's looking for an outlet. She sees that her mom is not in control, and she's going, how do I control my life? And to say that 11-year-olds don't have those thoughts would be crazy. I have an 11-year-old daughter at home. I think I know a little bit. I don't know it all, but I know a little bit about what goes through their heads and how mature they actually are at that age. So kind of the premise of the movie is she sees this other group of girls who are dancers and sees them practicing. She gets involved. There are so many different. I think that if this could have been portrayed without the child actors, I think there's probably a lot more that could have come from it. But I will say the one thing that struck me is in those scenes where it is so horrendous that they put these girls through this. I couldn't help but think, how many times have I seen a music video? How many times have I watched a movie?
Yeah.
How many times have I seen an adult woman, a TikTok, an adult woman in this position doing these moves? And I just haven't really thought anything of it, because I just thought, well, this is the culture we live in. So then if you want to get mad about this, then you need to look at your own children. You need to start looking at what you're allowing your children to consume. Because in this movie, the resolution, sorry, spoiler alert, there's even a point where her grandmother talks to her, who was Muslim, and was like, hey, the 11-year-old girl has her period. The grandmother confronts her, kind of makes a joke about it. And she says, oh, when I was your age, I was being married. And so here's another thing, right? Like, we want to separate it. We want to put this legal age on it and go, well, when you're 18, then all this stuff is okay. But I don't think we're just looking at our daughters and our sisters and our mothers and our wives as women, no matter what age. that we should respect these women. And so this, if it did accomplish anything, I would hope it would awaken that in people to go, what in the world? This is so inappropriate. And if you feel this is inappropriate for these young girls to be dancing this way, then what are you allowing into your life elsewhere? And what are you allowing by having your kids on TikTok? And I see young girls doing TikTok dances in the grocery store. And so this movie may not have made great choices, but to just go out and go with this cancel culture against it because you have no perspective on it. It is trying to tell a story. And at the end of the movie, that was what the spoiler alert was for. They get to their big dance competition. They're performing their inappropriate dances for an audience. The audience is repulsed naturally. The girl just stops. Her other friends are still dancing, and she has this kind of realization, looking in the eyes of these people that, what am I doing? What am I chasing? What's going on? And she runs home to her mother. And I think it's in that moment where they're telling this story of what we're subjecting our kids to, because we're telling them this is what a woman is. This is, if you want to be a woman, this is what it is. And obviously she had two choices, right? She either was what the society told her to be, or she lived in the hurt and pain that she saw her mother living in this oppressive religion. And so she's faced with these two choices. And I think that when you look at it this way, we can have like a more maybe nuanced conversation about what's going on here and not just jump to conclusions immediately. And I'm not trying to justify everything about this movie. I'm just trying to like say that there's a bigger conversation here, that if it makes you feel gross, if it makes you feel upset, then you need to get involved in making a change.
And you don't find this out in the movie, unfortunately, but through an interview with the director, she says it's based on a true story. It's based on parts of her life, like that dance competition that you were talking about, and the audience being repulsed. Like that was based on a real life thing.
Yeah, she was in an audience similar to that,
and how it's hard growing up in that culture. So I think she maybe, in wanting to share her story, I think maybe was a little ignorant of maybe how it would be taken when she had a
I'm only playing devil's advocate in this, but I do think that I would not have had an adverse reaction to this if they had adult actors doing this, because you would have gone, oh, okay, well, I can rationalize all this away because it's fake, it's Hollywood. But when you see that, you go, oh my gosh, what are we doing as a society? What are we allowing into our lives? What are we accepting as normal for our children? Yeah. And I think it's a really, really scary thing. I don't know. We could have probably a whole episode conversation about this because there is a lot there. And I'm not in any way encouraging anyone to watch this because it's not really.
I definitely, yeah.
And I think that's the thing, as a culture, we really struggle with movies because a lot of times there's a lot of people just look at it as entertainment. And I think when you look at art in any form and you can look at it as commentary as well, then there needs to be a conversation there. And some people just can't. Some people are like, oh, that's silly. I'm not going to look at art as a commentary on society. It's all for entertainment. So when you look at things that way, then you immediately just discredit anything that they might be trying to do. But at least we're having a conversation. And if you're upset about this, I think even here at the church, we have ways for people to get involved with human trafficking through at least that's in Africa. I'm sorry, I forgot the name.
Hands of Honor.
Yeah,
Becky was on here, and
there are other organizations that you can get involved with that I think, like, if you're that as you become aware, it's I don't know, it's a difficult thing, but if you're really outraged, let's actually do something about it than just tweeting a hashtag.
Yeah, like where are you gonna, if you just take that Netflix money and put it somewhere else? That's just entertainment and entertaining you. Yeah, it's just difficult. Like, what are real things you're gonna make? Like, now that you have this awareness, I'm not, like I said, I'm not gonna watch it, but now that I have like this awareness or this reminder that this is a reality of culture, and then I like have to look at my daughters and I think about that, and I think of this being, some people's life and option. It doesn't, like, if I'm just moved to anger but not into action or bringing justice, then I think shame on me a little bit too. So,
and I will, just one thing I have to add, I'm sorry, I feel like I've talked a lot and I don't mean to, but I'm very passionate about this because I feel like the sex trafficking thing has been something I've been passionately against for a very long time, and it's just like recently it's become part of the mainstream. All of a sudden everyone's acting like it's a new thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of times sex trafficking happens with the kid's family. It's their parents, it's their uncles, it's their relatives who are sex trafficking them. So it's a lot easier for us to pretend there's this big scary monster out there that's abducting children and putting them into slavery, which I'm not saying that doesn't happen on certain occasions, but the reality is it's in our own homes. And so that's the reason that it's so easy for us to like just try to like pretend it's not happening around us and point our finger at political parties or celebrities or whatever we want, because we don't want to face the dangers that are actually right in our backyards. So, all right. Up next, we're going to continue somewhat of this conversation as we talk more about, you know, how difficult it is for Christians to talk about sex in general. All right, we finally did it. We finally got to an uncomfortable conversation. It's taken us many episodes, but we're going to talk about Christians talking about sex and how it is a very awkward,
S-E-X.
difficult. I mean, my first exposure to any type of a Christian talking about sex was that DC Talk song.
That's
no, not that one. That was a secular song.
secular crap. Got that on the wrong like, shuffle.
What is that? I can't even think of the melody now. It's like SEX is a test when I'm pressed. Something like It was like I think God is doing a new thing album. New thing, is that the name of the album?
They said sex.
Nice throwback.
I don't want it. That's what it was. I don't want it. I don't want it.
Boom.
Yeah. Anyways, but that was the first time, like, as a
but
teenager,
we really do.
As a teenager, going, whoa, Christians can talk about this stuff. Like, I mean, I didn't know. Like, I was
You're
scared
probably
for
like, whoa, he's not a Christian.
I was scared for my parents to hear that song. I would always skip it.
They're gonna throw away my CD if they know they said that word.
Yeah. But you know, why do you guys think it is such a like taboo? I mean, I think we all kind of have an idea why it is, but like, what's those things? Let's just go ahead and say the things that people are thinking that they're afraid to say on a very PG scale. But what is it? Why is it so taboo?
I just think it's how you grow up and like what adults are making it look like in your eyes of like, well, this is disgusting. Like, I never want to do that. Like, if I do that, I am just going to go to hell. And so that's always how it's talked about. So,
or not talked about, because that's others.
Yeah.
Or if it is talked about, if somebody's doing it outside of marriage or whatever, if it's talked about, it's this disgusting thing of like, oh, I can't believe they would do that. Or like, why are they, doing that? And so it's just like, well, if I talk about this with someone else, they're going to think I'm gross.
Yeah.
Like, that's just your initial, like, mind connection.
So it's rooted in shame.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
You're taught it, too. I mean, it's mirrored to you where you're kind of like, you start making associations of, okay, this is okay to talk about. It's not okay to talk about. Somebody else is doing it, and that's bad because they're not married.
Yeah. Even like, I just feel like physical like affection with parents, or like, it's like, ew, that's gross. Like your kids are immediately taught like, oh, gross. Like my parents are like holding hands or whatever. And I just think that's initially just a horrible thing too. Like, why are you teaching your kids that it's bad for your parents to like show love to one another in like a physical way? There's just a lot, especially in the Christian culture that goes into that.
And we're all bringing so many different aspects to it, because some of us are underexposed, some of us are overexposed.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's okay, what's not okay? There's so many opinions back and forth.
For sure.
Why, Eric? Why?
I don't know. I was hoping the pastor would tell me.
Jesus, juke us.
It's just difficult to talk about. I mean, I think, like you guys have said, for me, why it's been difficult is you just have different, both my parents grew up in different environments, and so they both are bringing something to the table about what they're talking about. And I probably even like my mom being from a divorced household, and my dad not being from a divorced household, and even things like that happen in someone's life. There's probably shame and different levels of their comfortability to talk about it. I think one of the things we don't like to admit is our mistakes or the ways that we've fallen prey to this kind of stuff in our life to our kids. And so that's a difficult kind of conversation to have. And when do we introduce it? How do we introduce it? I think in a lot of ways it's because it's we want to be cautious, you know, and so we want to be cautious about this conversation because we don't want to introduce this to somebody too early and get their minds wandering. And so I know for me working with middle schoolers, you know, all the time, that was always, you know, with sixth graders, it was like, when do we have these conversations about purity? Because, you know, there's sixth graders that literally know way more than they should know. Yeah. And then there's sixth graders, like I joked earlier about somebody like saying, oh, Cuties, you're talking about oranges today? And then there's like literally the sixth grader in that same ministry, you know, one that like knows about masturbation and one that's like, what? You know, and so all of the language around that, we're all at a different playing field based on, you know, our families and situations and their shame and baggage that's brought into it. And then leaning into how scripture talks about it and then leaning back into our culture and what is a minor and all that kind of stuff throughout history. So there's just so many
and you don't really know if you can bring it up based on all of that. It's like, okay, I'm having a conversation maybe with like a girlfriend and it's like, okay, can I talk about this or not? Like, it's one of those, like, you go first and then I'm like, okay, we can talk about it and like not a big deal. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, is this okay to talk about? Is it not? It's a hot topic, which is why we're talking about it.
And so much of shame is based in fear. And I think like for me growing up, it was just, I was scared of that conversation. Like it was just not talked about. And like the thought of talking about it or I mean, God forbid, actually participating in it before marriage, that was like, I mean, that's it was scary. You were terrified of it. And so, but then a lot of times we don't talk about how that screws us up for our married lives. Like how we can't, now we've been so conditioned and we're filled with shame and fear. And now it's like, we can't even talk openly about it with our spouse. It's like this thing that just like happens when the lights are off and you don't want to talk about it or anything. I mean, I'm not saying we need John Madden in there, like giving us a play-by-play, but it's just like, how do you,
Johnny,
like, you know, but like, how can you need to have those conversations, but then there's so much shame around it. It's hard to do that.
We even had like recently, you know, my kids are curious. And so they're like, don't let your mind wander too far. But they're like, hey, what do you like? My 5-year-old was like, what do you guys do when we go to sleep? You know, and there's a lot of things we do when our kids go to sleep, you know, but like, we're like, there's like a mutual agreement. We're not telling our 5-year-old everything we do when we, you know, when they go to sleep. And so even for us, it's like, okay, at what point my parents, I discovered what they did when we went to sleep way before like they ever told me, you know, that like I knew about sex.
My parents had sex until like I was 16 yesterday. And I was like, how was I born?
I think I was a little before 16 for me, but yeah, that is that weird conversation where I'm like, okay, at 5 and we're introducing like topics like pornography, good pictures, bad pictures, all that kind of stuff into their life. But when do we say, like, my kids see us kiss and like there's PDA or affection, but like when do we start to dialogue about that? And unless we are willing to talk about that to friends, it's like, I don't know, then I guess we're both shooting in the dark and it'll happen when it happens.
And Eric, you kind of talked about how it affects us. Like, obviously I feel like growing up is just kind of like, okay, don't have sex. And then, okay, you're married, like you can have sex and like, but it's like, well, what is, I don't understand, like, what is this? Or like, you know, having that like purity culture of like, it's this beautiful
was never
thing,
okay,
like,
and now it's okay.
Yes, or like, it's this beautiful flower, like don't crush it, like don't, you know, whatever. And so when you get married, if you've saved yourself for that moment, you're expecting like this amazing, like, oh my goodness, there's gonna be magic, like there's gonna be something. And we do not prepare people well if they are gonna do that for what it actually, it's just like there's so much just horrible.
I remember, you're making me think of like a conversation I had with a friend before he got married, like, and you know, and I was like, I don't know what advice to give you. Like the Christian advice is pretty much, it's like, I don't know grizzly bear in the woods pawing for berries in the dark. Like there's just no there's no good explanation to get because there's nothing safe.
Yeah.
Like it's just it's so dangerous. Like what do I tell you?
Well,
I don't know what to say. What's appropriate?
Yeah, and if the church doesn't form our concept of what that is, we're just going to learn it elsewhere. So from movies, like you see these romanticized movies of what sex actually is, and it's like, well, that's not reality, but like people have no idea. Like we are not helping, other Christians really get a good understanding of a biblical concept of sex.
It's almost like the era that we grew up in is we put certain things on a pedestal. So it's like we put virginity on a pedestal, and if you knock that thing over, you are failing. And and don't find somebody else that doesn't have that, because then there's going to be issues. And it's just like it's created this distorted viewpoint. I think shame is in it too, but I think it involves like expectations. It affects our intimacy when we're not creating those and having those conversations. So Alex, I love that your son asked you that and you're thinking about that, because I think we need to be ready to our kids are looking for security. Yeah. Like they're not looking for like mom and dad, fill in the blank. I'll let you guys do that. They're not looking for like the details, but they're looking for like, man, mom and dad are like hugging or kissing each other. And that's creating that security where they're going to come to you when you're reading them good pictures, bad pictures. And it's like my mom and dad, like they love each other. They're talking to me. Yeah. I can talk to them about sex. Cause you're right, Rachel. If we don't answer the questions, they're going to find it somewhere else. Right. They're going to find it from a friend. I mean, YouTube is dangerous. Yeah. So many different places. So
yeah, that expectation thing is big. Like, again, working with students. And when I was in high school, if you would have asked me, like, I would be like, once I get married, I'm having sex every day, like 6 times a day. That's just like, that's because it's something that you're craving. It's something that is being built into you throughout puberty. And it's a longing and a desire that you have, and it's good. And you're like, once I get there, married, all the time. Well, how am I going to get my work done? Yeah. How am I going to do anything? Because that's all I'm going to do, And then
and people bond over those things, like innuendos and like conversations. It's like nothing's off the table.
Yeah, and that's another thing that people don't prepare you for either. I'm kind of like, I'm not newly married, but I've only been married for 2 years. Of like, man, before it was so hard, and we were like trying to keep our boundaries, and that was like the biggest thing. And just thinking like, man, when we get married, it's gonna be so nice, we don't have to worry about that. But on the other end of like, actually it's harder to make that a time for you. Like people don't prepare you for that.
What's your schedule like this week?
Right.
8:00 Wednesday. I mean, some people do that.
Right. Yeah. And so it's just like when you're not prepared for that, you might think,
the dynamics
there's something wrong with us. Like we shouldn't have gotten married. Like there's something wrong with us. And I think that's another thing is like you're in isolation when you're not having these conversations with other couples. Cause I think that's been a huge thing for us is like when we can talk to other couples about that, we feel like less isolation and more like, we can relate to them, or we can, grow in that.
It's like, I'm normal.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And all of us are married here, right? And so that does become like who do you have those conversations with? We all work together. So is it appropriate to like have that conversation with one another? Like we're all on this podcast. My wife more than this other person knows my wife. And so like, is that weird? And is that taboo? And like having that figured out, I think is even a difficult thing in the conversation, because if you have road bumps or you have, things that are difficult that happen, there becomes even shame for you in your relationship, or, and there's just a trust. That's an intimate thing to trust somebody with. Like, so I can trust, certain people with, knowing how much money I make, or, knowing that I yelled at my kids and I get angry, but like, trusting with like that intimate of a thing in my life is difficult, so.
Well, and talking about, you mentioned that we were all married. I think this gets way more complicated when you're talking about single people in the church too, because you look at the way the church has handled that, and it's just save yourself for marriage. that's the end of the story. And then they'll quote scripture or whatever, and then that's kind of the end of it. But then I think for people who are married, it's hard for us to remember like what that's like, especially when you have a single person who has this expectation of, I'm going to get married when I'm this age, or I'm going to get married when I'm, whatever age, and then that doesn't happen, and they're just still single.
Yeah.
And if they're still going to abide by what they believe in the Bible and what they've been taught, like it's a whole new landscape to navigate. And a lot of times I think the church, it puts such a priority on marriage that we don't really consider all the Pauls in our congregation,
And we live in a culture that's so hypersexual that the pressure is daunting, and it's like, okay, even if you're single, it's like people are assuming things about other people, and
we live in a culture that is the most hypersexual it's probably ever been, yet adolescence is longer than it's ever been. And so, I mean, you even think to biblical times, and we're talking about like the movie, a movie like Cuties and all that kind of stuff, and what our thoughts are on what a minor is and all that kind of stuff, which I think are appropriate in our context. So I'm not saying we should think that like a 12-year-old is not a minor, because there's a lot of social norms that are just different. But we have to go back to like the times, even in the early, 1900s, or when Jesus was addressing this in Jewish culture, like 12, 13, 14 is when you were getting married. When you were an adult, that's what bat mitzvahs were for. That's what even so many cultures have, these coming of age ceremonies where you became an adult, and at that point you were having sex. And so that gap between having your period or going through puberty and when you could have sex was like 2 years, or even 6 months in some cases. But now people are having their puberty younger than they ever have historically, because of our diet and because of other social things happening. So they're saying you're going through puberty, you're having these urges younger than you ever have. Yet adolescence is stretched out to almost 20 years now. And since the 1900s, early 1900s, adolescence was like, 14, 16, and then you were 18, you got married. Even that 4 years was a long time to wait. But now you've got parents that are saying, save yourself for marriage, but don't get married until you have a career and you have your whole life figured out.
So you're like 35.
Yeah, and so we're saying, so good luck, be pure for 20 years. I know we didn't do it, but good luck.
And that's the thing, is we're expecting it to be easy for them, even though it's something that like we didn't do, our parents didn't do, and they're just like, yeah, that'll be fine. And it's like, what, really?
It's pressure. I mean, we have our lives mapped out for us, right? Because you took us up to adolescence and graduating college and getting married. And then what happens after you get married? When are you having kids?
Right. It's that 2-year mark.
Oh, you have one. Time for another one, because the first one's 2. I'm going to try for a girl. I mean, it's just like people are invited. Somehow it's okay to be invited into that narrative and to give those.
I think another thing is like being honest with your like own past like mistakes with like sexual sin. Like I think that's another thing that people, like my parents, I feel like they never shared that with me. They just said don't do it. And so it's like, okay, well then they were perfect and they didn't mess up, and so I need to be perfect and not mess up. And like I feel like if we're more open and honest with like how hard it actually is, I think that helps give people a little more like hope and like encouragement of like, okay, like every other Christian's not perfect, and I'm the only one that's struggling with this sin. Like I think it's bigger than that, but we just have to be honest and vulnerable with that.
Well, even inside of marriage, we are far more tempted into things than we would ever, and it's not just sex, but it's into intimacy, intimate relationships, because we just label like intimate equals sex. It equals, people getting together and having intercourse. But so much of intimacy happens way before that, and it happens in other relationships. And so sometimes we're longing for intimacy that we're not getting in a relationship, and we think that it can get fulfilled through sexual pleasure and all that kind of stuff.
We're trying to make that connection.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of times that's where it can become difficult. It's like, oh, I'm still having intercourse with you, but I'm not intimate with you, in that relationship. And so
well, just like the social dynamic of, oh, we're going to go on a first date and we're going to have sex on our first date. Like that's kind of almost a norm in secular culture at this point.
Or like you want to have sex before you get married, because if you don't, if it doesn't work well,
test it out.
then you shouldn't get married, because that's really important. That's like the most important thing. And like once you get married, I think you realize like there's so many other things outside of that are so important, like communication and just like intimacy that's different than sex. That's really important in your relationship too.
So do you guys talk to your friends about sex?
Only the ones I podcast with.
This podcast?
Your other podcast? Or
I think there are you have close friends that you talk about certain aspects of it, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's
I
weird.
definitely do.
Yeah,
friends
it's a
that I
weird
talk to about
thing
it.
though too. Like what? Like I think like you mentioned, Alex. Like how far is too far in those conversations? And
how far is too far? Let's go there.
That's a good question. I mean,
let's get uncomfortable.
How far? I think there are definitely people that I have those conversations with that are guys, and I know as well that their wives are having those conversations with my wife. And so to me that feels like there's security in that, because there's
safety.
There's an equal sharing or equal vulnerability in that. And so I think that's one of the difficult parts around this is like who starts that, like who begins to open up that vulnerability, and what if it's not received well on on the other side, or what happens when it goes wrong, or what happens. So.
And I think even talking about detail, I think Jess, maybe you're kind of like, how detailed do you go? Or what,
I just say like, let's.
And like, I think if you look at it in a mature way, I mean, when you're married and you're talking to other married people, it's just as important as like communication. So if I sat down with another married person and was like, we felt comfortable talking about our communication, it was like, we're really struggling in this area of communicating. You might, give some advice or give some tips or have someone who is, I feel that comfortable with intimacy as well. It's like we are on the this is an important thing in our marriage. We might be struggling in this area. What's some advice that you have? You're married too, you love the Lord. Like I don't know, I would feel safe enough to go to that extent of details. So
we live in a very sexually repressed culture in general. I mean, the country we live in is very repressed that way. Whether that's good or bad is probably not for me to decide. But then when you add that extra layer of Christianity in this purity culture that we live in, it does make it much more difficult.
Right.
But having those conversations even with your spouse is sometimes impossible, to
it's
have
hard,
it in a good way or a healthy way, because then there's no base set. Because you can't talk about it and then because then there's all these inadequacies that start to rise up. Like, oh, well, you don't think I'm good enough, or you don't think I performed well, or you don't think I'm good at this, or you probably should just have somebody else. You should marry somebody else, because I'm not what you want. I'm not what you were looking for, or I'm not, so there's all these different types of conversations that can have even with just your spouse.
For sure.
And we're not taught how to talk about that. We're not even taught that it's okay to talk about that. It's just like God obviously created us in a way that sex is pleasurable. And so if it is that only just to encourage us to procreate? It's like, right. Or is it something, it's a union. It's a union between a man and a wife. Like, so I think some of that stuff, it's uncomfortable.
And you have to look at those conversations the same way. I think if you look at it the same way you look at any other conversation in your marriage, like as Christians, when we're married, we want to serve each other. Like the best way that marriage is going to work out is if you're constantly trying to serve each other and honor each other. And I think if you look at sex the same way, it's like, how are we able to serve each other through this as well? And it makes that conversation maybe a little less awkward of like, we really want to serve each other and care for each other, just like we do in every other part of marriage. So
and I think there's so many other things that go into like a sexual experience, I would say, like how the engine is revved or whatever. Sometimes you might think like, hey, am I, like you were saying, maybe not attractive enough? Did something happen? I added 10 pounds. Is that why you're like, you're pushed off from me? And it's like, no, you've just been a jerk this week. Or no, you just haven't helped with the kids lately.
You didn't do the dishes.
That is not and so honestly, for understanding the difference in men and women come into this in a huge way is like learning that about your spouse and learning, those things that maybe make you less attractive, and like, hey, it's going to make it tough when you're a jerk to not just your wife, like, hey, I'm really nice to you. What do you mean? But you're a jerk to the kids. And that is a turn off to me, so.
Yep. I also think going along with that, Alex, it's like, I've struggled with this and I have other friends that have too. It's like when you have sex with someone, especially like, in a marriage relationship or a close relationship, it's like, I'm bringing in triggers and things that maybe I don't realize like how it's affecting me. So it's like past hurts or questioning myself, like you guys have said, or like just recognizing all the different ways that we're affected and how something that God created us to do, to enjoy, to share with someone is very distorted, but also like Satan wants to attack that because it's a way that we can connect. It's a way that we can feel loved.
Yeah.
Not that that's the only way, but it's like there's so many things that go into that. And it's like, I want to feel like you heard me today and you listened and you cared about me. And then, it's just a lot that we bring into it. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And it's hard to talk about. Even like having a conversation with your spouse can be like uncomfortable. There are times where I'm like, okay, we need to talk about this. Or he's like, we need to talk about this. And
I think there's a lot of couples I know that are like, no, we don't talk about that. Like, that's weird.
So what do you guys, what would you guys say to somebody that is, married and is having a hard time having like those first conversations about sex? Like, what are some good ways we can have conversations?
Yeah.
It's probably later on.
I think that's, I think always coming from not a like, okay, here's what you can do better, but here, like, is there anything, how are you feeling? Like, do you feel safe? Do you feel loved? Like, and more of a from your perspective and less from like, this is what you can do better, or we need to talk about this. I feel like anything, like in any argument, that's always a good posture to come from. So that's just helpful, I think.
If I have a pro tip, I guess, I think one of the things I learned like at a marriage conference around having this conversation is like preparing for the conversation, so they were like in their example, this couple that was leading the marriage, thing was like, we had a candle in our kitchen. And so like, the husband, if he would light the candle, before he went to work, and that was like the sign that, to not, because she was saying, it's the bat signal, because she was like, I have to be prepared, and so like, even like if you can have things that are symbols or like an emoji, maybe for us it's sending the candle emoji, maybe not lighting a candle. Dad, why do you light the candle every day? My kids, I don't want to answer that right now, but so I think it's having those conversations about how can we like have the conversation, or how do we prepare ourselves well? How do we not just spurn it on one another? Literally, if you have to schedule it, like there's people that literally then schedule it. And so it's that communication style around each person and saying, what do you need? Like what are your needs that are gonna help me serve you, like you said, Rachel.
And I think also in a relationship, people are there's personality types. Yeah. So some people are going to be great at initiating it, and others are going to be like, no, I don't want to initiate it. I don't want to even think about, like, that's your job. Like, but I think identifying those things and talking through those things and realizing who your spouse is going to make for a much more healthy relationship than just being like, oh, why don't you never want to have sex? What's wrong with you? Like, it's like, we'll understand why that is, or how they are. And
that just even makes me think of the assumption, like, well, the guy is a spiritual leader, so he always has to initiate everything. Like, I can't do anything or move until, like, he initiates everything. I think that's a common misconception that people have too. So just talking about that is so helpful.
We've touched a little bit on parenting. I think that can also kind of lead into a little bit of a conversation maybe about even singleness. We kind of touched on that as well, but this is a conversation that faces, our kids, if you have, for those of us who have kids, but also like our single friends, like what's our responsibility to them when, some of these conversations are definitely not appropriate to have with them. But also it's like this, when, like you said earlier, Jess, we put these things on a pedestal. How do we navigate that? It seems like a scary thing sometimes, and because we don't want to be responsible for causing someone else to fail morally and potentially hurt themselves. But also, I think there's sometimes when people have been single for so long, there's a sense of desperation and maybe like I feel left out, and I'm not part of the married party.
Yeah. One of the things I'll offer to as a resource, not get into it a ton, but is we did a series a few years back called Hypersexuality, or something around that, life in a hypersexual world maybe. So we can put that in the show notes, but we had someone that was single. I think it was actually Lisa, who was on our podcast a few weeks ago, really helped dive into that and help us explain that. But to me, I think one of the frameworks we have to understand is that sex is good. It's a gift from God. Marriage is good. It's a gift from God. Neither are ultimate. And so I think a lot of times we can act like we've arrived because we are actually married and we get to have sex as if it's ultimate. Like it's satisfied all of us, but it's not led any of us to an ultimate satisfaction. Our marriages have satisfied us and they're gifts, but none of us are ultimately satisfied in that. They're foretaste of something greater. And I think singleness is good. And it's a gift from God as well, just like marriage is. And so they're both gifts from God. Celibacy is good. It's a gift from God. Like Paul talks about how it's a gift that he's celibate. Jesus, and there's tons of Old Testament prophets that never experienced those types of things. And so they're both gifts that can actually make us more like God, that can actually make us more in his image, that can sanctify us in different ways. And so I think understanding that is key in the conversation.
Yeah, it's good.
I like how you put that too, because it's just like, I think even for me, I felt like I was going to reach my maximum potential as a Christian when I became married, like when I got married, because we do value marriage and like the picture of the gospel that it is. Like when you're married, like it is a picture of the gospel, and like God has created this so that you can see that. And so I think sometimes, especially for single people, like that's hard to maybe think like, well, I am not a complete Christian, or I don't fully understand the gospel until I've reached this like marriage and understand what that looks like.
Or people don't take me seriously or give me credibility.
Right. And like sex too. It's like I don't get to do that until I get married. And so it's like, yeah, kind of almost putting your satisfaction in those things of like, well, once I get there, I will, feel good about everything.
Which creates a major letdown when you get there.
Yes, yeah, because it doesn't. I mean, there's just like, it's amazing, but it's not ever going to fully satisfy, like you said, Alex.
Yeah, I think also, Jesus, he had a few encounters with people that were a little risque. There was obviously the woman that they brought before him and all the religious leaders, and the famous, he is who is without sin, cast the first stone. And then he, says, you're forgiven, go in peace. Like he knew what she did, but he didn't approach it in shame. First, he met her with grace, and then he gave her another way. Same with, the woman at the well, where he has an encounter with the Samaritan woman, and he's, like, go tell your husband, and he already knows. She's like, what do you mean? No, you've been with 5 guys. And she is just so amazed by the grace, and she runs back to her town, and she's like, come and meet the man who told me everything I ever did, and he still loves me. He's not condemning me. And I think some of those things of realizing that, like even Christ, as he says, no greater, there's nothing greater than a man laying down his life for a friend. It doesn't say spouse there. And so I think learning friendship and spiritual friendship and all of those types of things, we're all designed for intimacy, but intimacy is not just sex. And so I think you can have a lot. There's a lot of marriages where sex is happening and intimacy is not, and so that's where I think people go seek for those desires to get fulfilled somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. Sorry, earlier I went in two directions at the same time and we didn't really land on one of them. So we talked about singleness a little bit. Let's maybe wrap things up with a little bit about parenting too, because I think kids are young and impressionable, but they're also curious and they're also really smart, and we don't give them credit for that. I think like my kids, they're 9 and 11 now, and even a couple of years ago, they're like asking, where do babies come from and that sort of stuff, and it's not like you're ready to sit down and draw diagrams and things like that. But also they're curious and they're smart, and they know when you're lying. They know when you're like making things up. So, and I think also even like our conversation about cuties and things like that, when they're faced with these things, if we're not having these conversations with them, it's so much more easy for them, I think, to get caught up in lies and being deceived by other people and finding their value in that. When you hear about sex trafficking and things like that, a lot of times it's not just like, oh, someone got kidnapped, but they got lured into something. Like they got lured into someone saying, hey, you want to make some money on the side, or hey, and then all of a sudden it feels like this person values me and this person cares for me, where I'm not getting that from my parents because they seem kind of closed off. And I think that's one of my biggest fears with my kids, is that I am not open enough with them that they feel like they can't come to me and talk to me about those things. And so I wonder, do we have any like practical tips, or maybe there's just like, maybe we have like a cautionary tale, maybe we messed up or our parents really messed up on something that we could share with people that's maybe encouraging or helpful?
I'll just give some thoughts and maybe it'll spur some people on, but, in thinking about, I have 3 boys, so my oldest is 6.5, and one thing that we decided to do from the beginning was we call everything by anatomical terms.
Yeah.
So we don't make nicknames for things, and so we call a penis, a vagina, and that's just what we do. And and when someone new comes into our house, I say, hey, he knows these words, so if you hear these, like, that's just what we call him. So he'll let me know, like, if that happened.
When they walk in the door, is that kind of like?
Is that just the first?
No, like if he had a
house.
babysitter, I don't want to make a joke about this because this is like, if there was a babysitter, like that's just what I say, and that lets them know that we have an open conversation,
right?
And even by using that term, like, I just feel like that's a way that we can have communication.
Yeah.
And what was it? There was another thing too, but I'll come back to it. Somebody else have something?
I joked.
What? You're trying to make a joke.
I ruined your moment.
Sorry. Great job.
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
She got it.
One thing that we've also done is we keep surprises. We don't keep secrets. So that's just like something that we say, and it's not something that I like drill into my kids.
Yeah.
But I'm like, hey, you can keep a surprise from dad, but we don't keep a secret from dad. And like the difference of like, okay, so then I create moments where it's like, hey, we're going to surprise dad with this, and this is something we don't tell him.
Yeah.
And then, just like having fun with that in a backhanded way, like that is creating that security with your kids. That's creating like that conversation. So we start to do, little things like that. So that's like 2 things that we've chosen to do.
Yeah. I think that's so good. I think starting young with like little things is going to help so much longer in like the long run, when you're like, well, we'll just wait until they're 13 and then we'll have the talk about all these things. And like, that is just overwhelming, and like,
especially now when they're finding that stuff out earlier and earlier.
Yes. And just like, if you sat down and we're like, okay, we're gonna have to talk about it or whatever, are you gonna feel comfortable to really share with them what you need to share with them? And like, I just think you need to slowly integrate some little things in their lives where they're like talking about like the anatomically correct, words for things, and like that will help you later on when you're starting to have those conversations with them. They already know those things. They already understand what that means.
Yeah.
I think just slowly as they're getting older, obviously I don't have kids yet, so I can't say that I know that this is the right thing to do. But
I think for me too, we can't be driven by fear, and I think so many times that's the motivator.
Yeah.
We're so scared that our kids are going to have sex before marriage. We're so scared that they're going to do something that we wouldn't approve of, that we hide things and we make things shameful, we make things scary, and that's just not healthy. And like I'll catch myself doing that. I'm like, why am I doing this? I need it's like a lot when kids are real young, and if like someone says a bad word on a TV show, they don't know it's a bad word.
Yeah.
They know it's a bad word when you say,
right. They don't know.
Cover your ears.
They don't know until you make a big deal about it and go, oh my goodness, you can't say, don't you ever say that word. And now their curiosity spiked. And now they're going, oh, what is this word? I want to learn more about this word. I should use this word. I get a reaction. And so as parents, like we've got to learn to not like discolor our kids' view of the world because we're so perverse, because we've had so much conditioning, because we've gone through so much garbage. It goes back to even like the troll thing, the button in its crotch that everyone freaked out about. And it's like, that was a button, so when you set it down, it made a silly noise. But people get so worked up about it because we've been so conditioned to believe that everything is perverse and everything is sexualized that we can't even see the world through a child's eyes, and then we go and we ruin it for them. And it's like, how do we keep that stuff precious, but yet we still have those conversations?
Yeah.
And a book that really influenced me, I really did impact my parenting, because it is scary raising kids of any age to me. I think I'm always going to be a little like, oh my goodness. But the book by Rachel Dufour, Hooray for the Vajayjay, it's a funny name, but like it deeply impacted my view of sex, my view of how I will talk to my kids about sex, and it gave me like some good outlines of how to do that and just to be comfortable with it, so I can say that to you today, and like we're having a practical conversation about it. Like,
right.
You should probably
So that
talk
was
to her
helpful.
about using the anatomically correct term, though.
Maybe we could get her on the podcast to talk about that
Maybe.
sometime. To me, one resource, and I think I've talked about this before, is that there's a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior, that talks about these things with your kids. It introduces the word pornography. But I think one of the differences, and I would always say this to middle school parents, is like, even when I was a kid, if I wanted to like find porn, I had to be the hunter. Now kids are the hunted. This stuff is hunting for them. And so, not to live in fear, but you do have to know that you can't be ignorant to it, and you have to know, don't just give your kid a phone and connect to any social media. Don't just let them be on YouTube. Like, use YouTube Kids. Go on and take the time to learn how to use the tools that are parental controls on all of these things, because your kid's heart's at stake. And so it's not like, don't just be lazy and flippant because you didn't have that. You don't know all of the chaos that can happen there. So even for us, we've used that book, and even a couple weeks ago, my son, we were putting him to bed and he was crying, and he's like, you guys know that book? I needed to tell you something. And he didn't do anything wrong. And it wasn't like this wild big deal, but for us, because he was like, felt comfortable, and he's like, had that reference to that book and something he had seen, like Aaron and I, like, that's a conversation we both are like, we never want to have that conversation with our kid, but thank God, like, at 7 that he just had that conversation with us about something he had witnessed, and so it wasn't a huge deal or anything, but that opened the door.
But it was for him.
And even for us, it was an opportunity for us to say, buddy, that's like the Holy Spirit speaking to you. Like, God talks to you. And we are so proud of you for listening. Like, that feeling that made you cry, and that feeling of guilt and knowing right from wrong. Like, we have to celebrate that and stoke that fire in them. And like how we approach that like, I wanted to be like, you have that. I don't want to talk about, like, I wanted to like, it was awkward. Like, my son is 7 and I'm 33, and it was still awkward for me to like, oh no, we have to have this conversation right now. But I'm so thankful that we did. And so that's a great tool that we can even put, maybe in the show notes or something. But it's been powerful for us.
I think, Alex, you said like we used to be the hunter, and now we're the hunted. That applies to kids, and I'm thinking that applies to singles, married couples. I mean, that applies to everybody, of like, we need to be on guard, and we need to
Yeah, be aware of
Be
that
looking
stuff.
for that.
Yeah.
This has been a really great conversation, and I'm sure we could go on for another hour, another 2 hours or whatever. But you had a funny thought. Did you want to share it with the class?
We made it all the way
If you're
through,
gonna make
Alex.
if you
we
made it all the way to the
we knew
end.
it was going to be very difficult to have this conversation because I'll try not to make jokes and giggle but you just broke
we made
it
a
now.
pact before this started
to get all the giggles out.
to keep it Christian.
Okay, I'll end the podcast.
Okay.
All right. Now, hopefully, I hope we could have more conversations like this.
Yeah.
I know it's tough and it's awkward, but I think as a church, because we are the church, we can do a better job at it.
Yeah.
And this is just like a small step. And we're in no way saying that we did it great today.
We might not be the sexperts.
No, but I think that it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully this can continue into further conversations down the road.
Yep.
Thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear feedback from you, or questions or concerns. You can reach out to us on social media at CCC Omaha, or you can send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.